want to kind of get an idea on these functions to determine if they're even or if they're odd. And what does that help us understand, or maybe what does that help us do? So to kind of give it a sense of this, let's look at what a cosine does as just an example. So let's say that I have some angle that I mark out as positive t. And I want to compare it to the angle that I mark out as negative t. So what do you think the comparison or relationship between the cosine of those two functions are? I want to get a sense of, well, what's the cosine of positive t and what's the cosine of negative t? Well, if we remember, the cosine represented its x value. And in both of these cases, the relationship between those, they're both a positive x value. So the cosine of positive t and the cosine of negative t both equal a positive or the same value. So in that case, we can say that the cosine is an even function. So let's contrast that to the sine, because I think the sine will be different, and it's always good to see contrasting to get a sense of what's happening. So the sine of t compared to the sine of negative t, remember the sine that represented its height or its y value? So the sine of positive t had a positive y value or a positive height, and the sine of t over here, we go over x and we go down y. So we get a negative y. So the sine of positive t is a positive y. The sine of negative t is a negative y. So when that happens, we would call that an odd function. And then working with the sine and cosines and thinking through the rest of the functions, we can say then that our tangent is going to be an odd function. Its cotangent is going to be an odd function. The sine was odd, the cosecant will be odd. The cosine was even, the secant will be even. So we can identify the 6 functions we have, 2 of them being even, 4 of them being odd. So that could help us if we look at some particular angles. So I'm curious, if I can think what the cosine of negative 45 is. Well, maybe to begin with is, let's determine if it's an odd or even function. We remember that the cosine of any angle was even, as an even function, so the cosine of negative 45 is the same value as the cosine of positive 45. And then from there, we just got to remember, what was the cosine of 45 degrees? And if we remember that, the cosine of 45 was a root 2 over a 2. And again, that's just something that we kind of had memorized, or we remembered from a couple of sections ago when we started working through the different 45 and the 30-60 degree triangles and what those produced. And so when we looked at the 45-45 triangle, we saw that its cosine, or we remembered it, we constructed it and figured out that it was root 2 over 2. So again, that is something, some of the basic measurements are the ones we want to kind of have memorized. And that's where the root 2 out of 2 came from. It was memorized. Another one we want to look at is the tangent of negative pi thirds. So to begin with, let's get a sense of is if that's an odd or an even function. Tangents were odd functions. What that translates to, that means that if I took the tangent of a negative value or a negative angle, that would be the same thing as the negative of its positive value. And so now I just need to go back and remember, what was the tangent of pi thirds? And again, that was out of those triangles that we discovered in a couple of sections ago. The tangent of pi thirds was root 3. So then the value or the tangent of an angle described by a negative pi thirds radians equals a negative root 3.